Awesome. Thanks very much, Nate, and good afternoon. Excuse me, good morning to each of you, depending upon where you're calling in from. We appreciate you joining, as Nate mentioned earlier. Since we're offering continuing education, please find my financial disclosures available for your review. And we're going to jump right into today's content. And I think many of us would agree, if you turned on the news media this morning, every day is a new adventure as it relates to this particular topic. My goal for you is really threefold. One is to give you a really good granular level view of the FDA's authorization process for emergency use. The second is to think about what we can do as either educators, clinicians, and also how we can empower our students to actually be involved in the vaccination process, both today and beyond. And then lastly, what can we do to ensure that that process will always be safe and reliable, and we're prepared for any contingencies that are associated with that. So I wanted to start first at sort of the federal level, and then we're going to work our way down to the actual sort of institutional level. So at the very top of our federal government, we of course have the Department of Health and Human Services, right? And this is really responsible from an infrastructure standpoint to approve drugs, regulate them. That also houses CDC. It also houses the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. So there's a lot of different moving sort of spokes of the wheel associated with that. As part of this, there's that public health emergency that takes place. And once that's declared federally, that opens up a lot of doors and resources related to how different things can move through the FDA particularly. One of the goals here is to make sure that we can get vaccine in the arms of people that need it most, to do it without a lot of barriers or bureaucracy, which we know that can sometimes be a challenge, to make sure that the supply chain is properly vetted and out there as well. So I wanted to give you a little bit of a picture that I think tells a very important story here. And this is one that we should think about as educators. We should certainly empower our students to be familiar with this. And lastly, and probably equally as important, is to talk about this with our own patients. And it's really sort of the vaccine life cycle. So let's just say that there is a declared public health emergency, and it doesn't even have to be for a novel coronavirus. It could be for anything, Ebola, anything similar. What we're going to determine is that there's something federally that's declared by the government, and it's going to be for a time-limited period of time. So it's not going to go on forever. And then we can essentially go through the normal vaccine development stages, which is going to be stage 1, 2, 3, and 4, just like we would for any other vaccine development. The sort of difference here is that you're going to expedite these processes, and some things, especially within the FDA, may be done in an expedited fashion as well as in a parallel pathway, right? So it's important to note that we do not take any steps out of the equation. We don't bypass any safety steps. There's nothing that's removed. It simply means that this is the priority of the FDA, right? Something that we have to ensure that we're doing in a linear fashion. Now, phase 1 is simple. That's really where we're looking at, is this particular vaccine candidate even safe? If it doesn't pass that test, all development stops. The second phase, phase 2, is where we then sort of tack on to that. Does it work? Is it effective? Does it actually do what it's designed to do? So in this particular case with COVID vaccines, really our primary goal was to keep people out of the hospital and keep you from dying, right? Now, secondarily, we're learning that many of these vaccines are very effective at reducing the risk of you even getting COVID in the first place, right? Which is very helpful. Now, phase 3, which is your largest clinical trial where you have thousands and thousands and thousands of people, is really we're going to tack on safety plus efficacy together. So you may be looking at 40 to 80 to 100,000 participants in these trials. Now, something to think about, and I think this is really important, is that in a normal non-pandemic situation, we don't normally have thousands or hundreds of thousands of people that are captive audience that meet the inclusion criteria to even get into a trial. That was very different with COVID, where we had millions of people worldwide that were not only impacted and infected, but were also willing to enroll in clinical trials to be a part of this solution. So that was extremely helpful to sort of shorten those timeframes to recruit the number of people that were needed to be part of that. Phase 4 is actually where we are now for all 3 currently marketed vaccines in the US. And this is sort of what we call post-market surveillance. So once something's out there, we have to continue to monitor it. Very similar to what we saw this morning on the news with the pause, if you will, federally on the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. This is exactly how the system is designed to perform. We see a potential safety signal. we stop everything, we evaluate it, we assess it, and we make a determination, right? And in most cases, we're not going to determine causality associated with the vaccine, but the process is designed for this reason, to sort of root out any potential bias that might exist there. So Nate, can we go ahead and do the first poll? Because I think it's a good time to do that. So our first question is, have you been fully vaccinated yourself for COVID-19? So have you actually been vaccinated for COVID-19? A simple yes, no, or if you're in the process, if you're at that only one, that first vote, then that's fine as well, put in the process. And let's see what we got for our results here. All right. So it looks like 91% of you said yes, 9% of you said no, and nobody's in limbo, as I like to call it. So that's excellent. Nate, let's go ahead and do that second poll question as well. All right. What percentage of your faculty have been fully vaccinated against COVID-19? So what percentage of your faculty have been vaccinated against COVID-19? And if you're not sure, we've added that choice for you as well, because I understand not everybody may know that number. And some people may choose not to share that information with us as well. Be really curious to see what this one comes out as. All right. So it looks like the majority of you are in that 76 to 100% category, which is awesome. And then a nice equal split between the 26 and 50%, and the 51 to 75, and 11% in the 0 to 25. So again, what's important to remember here is that nothing is cut out of the equation as far as ensuring safety of these vaccines. So as of today, the current ones that have emergency use authorization are the Pfizer, the Mrna, and the Johnson & Johnson, right? The AstraZeneca one was expected to actually be released here in the US back in February, but for obvious reasons, that one has not even come to that stage yet. And again, we're not expecting a ton of more vaccines coming to the market, at least here in the US in the future. So what are mRNA vaccines? This has been probably the second biggest question that I've gotten pretty routinely. And mRNA vaccines are not necessarily new. We've actually used them back in the 80s all the way up to recently. We just have not used them on this large of a scale. And frankly, they actually have a lot of utility for us in medicine because they're easy to manipulate. They're very, very safe from a manufacturing standpoint, and they're quick. Right. So you have the ability to very sort of genetically target things, if you will. It's almost like using a sniper rifle versus a bazooka. If you're thinking about like a shotgun approach where you're going to shoot all these pellets out, right, you're going to hit everything. What our goal with these vaccines is to target that spike protein, right? If we neutralize that spike protein, then we essentially inactivate the COVID virus's ability to replicate within the human body, right? And so the good thing with the mRNA vaccine, despite the name, is that it doesn't in any way alter the genetic code, right? And that's probably been the biggest thing, and rightfully so. I almost wish they were not called mRNA, because you instantly think, well, if it's mRNA, it must be associated with DNA. And that's certainly not the case. And so we've used this for things like Zika and Ebola and rabies and some other things in the future. And again, it's a very targeted approach that's not going to wreak havoc on other sort of molecular components within the cell. There, on the other hand, there are also viral vector vaccines, right, which is the Johnson & Johnson and the AstraZeneca. So sort of separate out this from the ones that we just talked about, the mRNA, which are your Pfizer and Mrna. So the viral vector vaccines still target the spike protein, and they've been around for a long period of time, actually back since the 70s, but they essentially use a vehicle, right? So think about it, you're driving down the road and you're on a motorcycle with one of the sidecars, right? And in the sidecar is actually the vaccine itself. But the motorcycle itself is this non-pathogenic virus that is just the vehicle to deliver the medication, right? And so in these particular viral vector vaccines, they use adenovirus, right? This is not one that can make you sick, because adenovirus causes all kinds of things like the common cold. But this is not one. It's actually been rendered neutral, but it just gets the sort of medication into the cell, right? Again, we're still targeting the spike protein. And then once we sort of produce that immune response, then we build the antibodies. Now, one of the things that I think is important, especially to today, is that each of these vaccines is essentially tricking your body into thinking you have COVID so that you can produce that antibody response to create that immune system sort of memory capability to say, hey, I've already had this exposure. This is not right. I need to fight this off, right? Unfortunately, when that happens in some individuals, you can have an inflammatory process that can lead to clotting cascade disorder, right? And that's what we may be seeing in some of the viral vector vaccines potentially. And again, we'll probably know more later this week regarding that. And I've got a few slides that we'll cover here in a second. One thing I did want to sort of, state out there in the clear open air is that none of these vaccines can give you COVID, right? We hear this all the time. This is probably the top question the CDC gets on their customer service hotline, right? There's no live virus that is capable of actually giving you COVID. And so we have to sort of sit down and explain this to people over and over and over again, especially those that are vaccine hesitant, frankly, including us. I probably spend more time explaining ingredients of vaccines than many other things. And if you show them sort of the full ingredient list, people are like, well, wow, I didn't know that you could actually see that. And so a lot of times think of it like a nutrition label. I need to know that what's in that product is not going to harm me. And there may be some circumstances, which we'll talk about here in a minute, where there may be individuals that are not ideal candidates for these vaccines based on the ingredients of those vaccines. So what in the world is this term EUA and sort of what does it mean? How does it sort of relate to EMS, and what can we do to educate our students and our faculty about it? So simply put, an EUA stands for emergency use authorization, right? And it is a declared public health emergency that has to be done at the federal level. And it again aligns a lot of resources within FDA to say, expedite approval of these types of things, right? That could be vaccines, it could be medications, it could be PPE. There's a whole variety of things that could take place. And it's not just for pandemics. It could be used for like a biological disaster, or if we had some type of terrorism event as well. But again, it's really designed to help us sort of expedite through normal regulatory processes while not compromising safety, right? And the other piece associated with this is that they're term limited. So as soon as that sort of federal declaration of disaster is withdrawn, so is the associated EUA. Now, it's important to note, I think, that it's not like the FDA is going to say, overnight, there's no more COVID vaccine available simply because the federal government says the pandemic is essentially over or diminished enough to not require that. They're not going to do that. They're going to work with the manufacturers to ensure, and they're doing this already, that they can go through the traditional FDA process so that there's no interruption in the supply chain of these vaccines. So as these things are approved, right, they go through an internal process with FDA. That is not enough, though. They go through an external review process by two specific groups. One is an FDA independent advisory board that's made up of people like us that are experts in their field. And then there's a secondary group at the CDC in Atlanta that is the Council for Immunization Practices, right? And they make sort of the generic recommendations about who to prioritize, when to give the vaccines, and they do this for everything, right? And that is also an independent group that is not at all affiliated with the government. Once that declaration is made that those two groups make recommendations and say, yeah, this is great, let's move forward, it's then finally up to the FDA as to whether or not to issue the EUA. In most circumstances, if both independent groups say, yes, let's greenlight this, they usually do. But there have been some instances where they will not do that, or they'll go back and require additional information associated with this. So in order to actually get an EUA, you have to do essentially four things. One is there's got to be some type of life-threatening serious condition. Well, I think we can check that box. Number two is that the product or sort of vaccine in this case that is being submitted has to show a substantial amount of efficacy, right? It has to work, and the efficacy should far outweigh any risk of the actual product itself. Right. And that really goes into step number three, which is there has to be a risk benefit analysis to say that sort of the seesaw effect of safety versus efficacy is well balanced. And hopefully we're going to see, a high level of safety and a high level of efficacy with a very low incidence of potential implications or side effects associated with that. And then lastly is there can't be other alternatives. So in this case, we didn't have testing initially. We didn't have any therapeutic options to treat. and we certainly didn't have any vaccines. And so you can see how quickly all of these products met the classification criteria for EUA. So Nate, let's go ahead and do the next poll question, please. Awesome. So what percentage of your students have been fully vaccinated against COVID-19? So we just asked you about yourselves and your faculty, but what about your students? And again, if you don't know, or if that's data you're not collecting in your program, that's fine too. Just go ahead and check that I'm not sure box, but be curious to see what we come back with. So as I would fully expect, about 50% of us are not sure. It looks like 25% in the 0 to 25, 16% in the 26 to 50, and then a nice equal split between the last two. So again, this is very consistent with what I'm seeing, and there also can be some potential student privacy right violations that might exist with asking certain questions depending upon how the state laws are written. And because this is an EUA vaccine and not a fully licensed vaccine, there have been some legal challenges already about this particular question. So I did want to make sure that we covered some things that are required by law and some things that are optional, right? Especially if you're teaching your students and faculty to be involved in a mass vaccination process, right? And we're going to be involved in these things for at least another year, right? And so the first two things are what I call regulatory required, right? Things by law as part of that EUA approval that we're required to give to the patient. Now, when I share these two things, I want you to think about, if you got the vaccine, did you get these two documents? I'd be very curious to see or hear from you in the chat if you did or did not. But most people are finding out that they have not been given. So the first one is a fact sheet for recipients and caregivers, right? And we're going to go through the two types of fact sheets here in a minute. There's essentially one for them, the patient, the recipient, right, or caregiver, and there's one for us as healthcare providers. And the second one that's required is the CDC vSafe handout, which I'll show you here in the end of the program today. And then there's a new one that's been out for about a month that is optional, but absolutely, in my opinion, should be required. And it's what to do after getting a COVID vaccine. This, to me, is one of the best possible patient education tools that you can give. I'm also going to give you a link to a video that you can actually use if you're going out and being a part of these vaccine clinics, where you can play this as people are waiting their mandatory 15 minutes. I'm going to be giving Nate an ebook following today's program that has not only all of the slides, but also every single resource that I mentioned today, so that you have that available, including the hyperlinks for each of the documents that you might need, so that you've got that at your fingertips as a free reference for you. So here are just the examples. So on the far left, you've got that fact sheet for the recipients. In the middle, of course, you've got that vSafe. And again, these are the two things that are required to be given. They can, however, be given electronically. So there is no reason that you have to kill every tree and give these in a printed format. You can certainly give these. A lot of places are using DocuSign and some of the other document management systems to be able to distribute these. And then on the far right is honestly my favorite document, which is what to do after, or what to expect after getting the COVID vaccine, right? So what should I expect? What are normal things? What if I get a fever? Should I take Tylenol? All of that type of information is contained within that document. So think about it like a great one-page summary to head off potential follow-ups, especially to emergency departments following that. Now, the mRNA vaccines have a lot of similarities, right? They're all intramuscular by nature. They all require 2 doses to achieve what we call fully vaccinated. But we know, particularly with the mRNA vaccines, even if you get 1 dose, right, you can even get up to 80% efficacy, which is fantastic. Think about that compared to the general flu shot that we have every year. So when I look at mRNA technology, I'm really excited about it. Yeah, there's a lot of things that we still want to learn about it, but the ability to scale this is going to be extremely helpful for us as well. There is minimal wait time, meaning that you want to wait that minimal time between dose 1 and dose 2. However, you can certainly go out from that. Now, the challenge is really when you get into sort of that 2, 3, 4, 5 week time frame afterwards, the efficacy is going to certainly start to wane off a little bit, right? And they're going to all target that spike protein, and none of them are going to even enter the DNA. So there's no cellular change that's going to take place with the actual genetic material. I wanted to give you an example of what each of them looks like. I just picked Pfizer randomly, just as one particular example. And you'll see that in the healthcare fact sheets, All of this information can be quickly derived, things like ingredients, what to look out for, who should not get this vaccine. Are there certain individuals that are high risk, what to look out for intended sort of potential side effects that we would expect as an example. But people that have underlying comorbidities, right? So let's say that this is an oncology patient, maybe somebody that's a brittle diabetic or an end-stage renal disease patient. Those are folks that if they get COVID, we know the data shows that they're going to have a very bad outcome, right? And we found that probably the biggest risk indicator predictor is actually obesity. And so if you're at a BMI of over 30, you're very, very likely to need mechanical invasive ventilation. And so there's a lot of things that we're learning, not just associated with demographics, but particularly with comorbidities with that. The other thing I wanted to mention is that many of us may have either pregnant faculty members, we may have pregnant students, or you may work in a provider type situation where you work with pregnant individuals that have questions about the vaccine. None of the vaccines that are currently on the market, when they went to the FDA, submitted data, nor did they have data at the time of submission for pregnant females, right? That has since changed because many people that were enrolled in the trials were unknowingly pregnant. And so there is a pregnancy database and registry that is studying the effects of this. If you're a pregnant healthcare provider, right, especially as an EMS provider, when that is your profession, unless you can get behind a desk and not work with patients and sort of isolate away, it's very difficult to not be exposed on a routine basis to COVID, right? And so again, we go back to that risk-benefit equation. What is my risk if I have COVID when I'm pregnant? And we know that the outcomes, all the data is showing very, very bad clinical outcomes associated with that, both for mom and baby, right? And so that's why the obese societies and other gynecological groups have recommended, for the most part, that you actually go ahead and get the vaccine after consultation with your OB. Then you've got sort of these public health implications, right? The fact that none of these vaccines can be 100% effective, which is, 94, 95 is astounding to me. It's particularly exciting, but it doesn't remove sort of our obligation to continue to have source control and adhere to our basic infection control practices, like wearing a mask and avoiding large groups of people and washing our hands and some of the basic things that we do, right? Now, the good news is that the CDC has updated their guidance related to quarantine if someone is fully vaccinated, right? And so that's a huge, huge advantage to us, especially for those of us in EMS that are struggling every single day with staffing issues associated with that. One thing I wanted to mention to you is that in that healthcare document, right, that is designed for us, one of the things I draw out here is the list of ingredients. This is something that, again, I would love to hear if anyone's been asked this in the chat box, because I've yet to find one single person anywhere in the country that I've talked to that has been asked, but are you allergic to any of the ingredients in the vaccine? And they show you the list, right? What a novel concept. And I particularly caught the one that I've underlined here. This is a direct copy and paste from the vaccine label, so I apologize for the wordiness of it. But that polyethylene glycol, otherwise known as PEG, is really the sort of root cause that we found with most true anaphylactic reactions associated with these vaccines, right? And so it is very likely that individuals will know that they have that reaction and they can tell us up front, but we need to ask the question. So even if you don't ask or show them all of the ingredients, I would absolutely teach our students and make sure us as clinicians and faculty members are always asking that patient, are you at least allergic to PEG? Do you know of any allergies associated to that? Right. And again, that's going to be very helpful for us to know up front. That is a contraindication for that particular thing. Any of our vaccine administrations, we want to monitor for a minimum of 15 minutes. And if there's any previous history of anaphylaxis for anything else, we're going to monitor those patients for at least 30 minutes. So here's two great resources that I've included in your ebook. Just as an example, on the far left is your standing orders, and these happen to be for the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine. And on the far right is actually the pre-vaccination form. These are hugely, hugely helpful. Particularly legally, the document on the right is a great way to have CYA. Right? Are you feeling sick today? Have you ever received a first dose? Do you have any history of allergic reaction? What happened when you did that? Do you have a bleeding disorder we should be aware of? Have you received monoclonal antibody therapy? These are all pertinent questions that we need to ask and have somebody available to answer questions, right? And then on the left, you're going to see those standing orders that talk about who to give it to, how to give it, what's the needle depth, what's the right bore and size of the needle, et cetera, because we know that if the vaccine is not administered into the intramuscular space and it goes into the subcu fat, then we're going to have decreased efficacy. We could also have an adverse reaction with tissue damage that we don't intend to have. The second piece of this is that we know now the regulatory piece, and we understand a little bit more about sort of the different types of vaccines, but how do I manage the vaccine event itself, right? Because there's always that possibility that somebody's going to pass out or they're going to have a true anaphylactic emergency. I worked a vaccine clinic here very, very recently, and we probably had about 10,000 people on a single day, and we had 2 cases of anaphylaxis, right? One of those was somebody that actually did have an allergy, was asked by 3 different people, both verbally and in writing, if they had an allergy, declined to say that they did, had an EpiPen in their purse, didn't tell anybody about it, and still went through the vaccination process. And lo and behold, we're taking them to the hospital. The other individual happened to be somebody that did not have an allergy that they were aware of, and both patients did fine, right? And the good news is that while COVID is very, very tricky, we certainly have good treatments that are well known to be efficacious with anaphylaxis. So again, making sure, especially students that are working these events that might be involved, are extremely experienced in what to do in an emergency. These are the 2 fact sheets available. The one on the left is for your healthcare providers, and then the one on the right is for your recipients and caregivers. I've put together in the ebook the vaccine documents for all 3 currently available vaccines. So you'll see the EUA stuff for Pfizer, Moderna, as well as the J&J. The first one, I believe, I put in the order of the ones for the patients, and the second one is for us. You'll find that the one for us is far, far more lengthy. It's going to have all of the necessary information in there that you're going to want to read. And I think we should all be reading that before we give that vaccine. As we mentioned earlier, you've got the same type of checklist available for each vaccine. So now you can see for Moderna, right? Now the vaccination checklist, pre-vaccination checklist, does not change by product, but the standing orders and some of the other materials may. And so as any additional therapeutics or vaccines come to market, CDC has committed to make those available free of charge on their website. And I'm also going to give you a whole host of tools, both for faculty as well as students at the end of today's program, that should make your life a lot easier. So what is the role of the person that's given the vaccine, right? Now, this may vary greatly by where you're sort of functioning in the process. Do I expect an EMT or paramedic student to be monitoring the storage of a vaccine? Absolutely not. Do I potentially expect a faculty member or someone who's a really well-seasoned clinician? Absolutely, they may be involved in that. That may be their assignment for the day. We're certainly going to all be involved at some point in preparation of the vaccine. We want to prepare it aseptically. We want to keep it clean and sterile. We want to make sure that we're not reusing needles and syringes, which unfortunately continues to be a problem in the US. And then getting that vaccine in the right place within the body. I've had several people ask me in the last few weeks, actually, can I only give the vaccine in the arm, right? And the vaccine is licensed specifically for administration into the arm, into the deltoid. But for whatever reason, if a patient has some type of issue, then you can give it into another large muscle, but that is not part of its initial indication. So just something to think about. And that's not been something that's been widely reported, but I've been asked that a lot. And then we've got sort of the documentation process. That may be that paper card that we give to people. It could be electronic documentation. We're certainly going to put this information in our state immunization registries. And then most importantly is educating the patients about what to expect, right? I got the Mrna vaccine and I took the vaccine at 11, was on the truck until 7 that evening. I was okay until about 9 o'clock that evening. And then I got sort of those traditional flu-like symptoms for about the next 24 hours. But I expected it. I was educated on it, but no one at the vaccine site, and it was run by the state, gave me any of the information. Right. And so I saw several of you put in the chat that you had never seen these pieces of information. You never saw the pamphlets. That's a very common thing that we see. And that's really going to help us mitigate some of this adverse events that we might have. Now, from a storage standpoint, particularly with the mRNA vaccines, right? These are not ones that we want to just take around town. They're very, very fragile compared to some of the viral vector vaccines. And the other piece associated with our students especially is that there's no preservatives. So this means that those vials are extremely susceptible to contamination. And so we want to make sure that people are keeping those vials as clean and sterile as possible and discarding them as soon as they're used up, right? And that's why we don't leave things in open vials for long periods of time as it relates to these. And again, the mRNA vaccines require that horribly low cold temperature storage, and some of the viral vector vaccines are completely opposite. So we can do room temperature and regular refrigeration. Now, when we're giving that vaccine, of course, we want to make sure we're giving it into the right spot, right? And so helping our students especially select the appropriate depth of that needle and the best site selection is going to be critical. And so we're going into that deltoid muscle, as I mentioned before. Of course, there's nerves there, right? And there's bone and all kinds of other things. So practicing and sort of doing simulation-based activities is going to be very, very important. Now, in some circumstances, depending upon where you are and your seroprevalence rate in the community, you may be wearing additional PPE, like a face shield, for example, or you might be wearing an N95 respirator versus a surgical mask. That will normally be dictated by what's going on in your local area. Certainly, if you're going to be going into areas where there is COVID, for example, I know a couple services that I'm familiar with have actually gone into nursing homes. They have COVID residents there too. So they do go in there with a respirator and some of the other PPE associated with that. But here's one of the top questions, and I'd like to stop for just a second and actually have you put in any comments you have about this particular topic in the chat. And the question is, should you wear gloves, right? Is there a reason that you should wear gloves when you administer an intramuscular vaccine? So if you do that, I'd love to hear from you. If you don't do that, I'd love to hear from you, and put your comments in the chat box. And while you're doing that, Nate, I'm going to go ahead and have you do the next polling question, if you don't mind. So our polling question is, do you have fears about contracting COVID-19 as an EMS provider or educator? Yes or no? So do you have personal fears about contracting COVID, either as an educator or a provider? Yes or no? Kind of anxious to see the numbers on this one. All right, so nice equal split. So almost an equal split there. So not surprising. So it looks like Leslie says, I always wear gloves during patient contact. So yes, I wear gloves during IM injection. Deborah says we do wear gloves. So there is actually no requirement either with OSHA or with CDC to wear gloves with regular IM injections. So there's no requirement to do that. Now, is it okay if somebody does? Sure, but we do have data that says the more we use PPE, the more likely we are to have cross transmission. And so if you're doing a good IM injection with good proper technique, the risk for blood or body fluid contact is very minuscule, right? And so yes, on every single TV channel where you see somebody given a vaccine, they're wearing gloves and they look like they're probably going to fight Ebola. But if you're really given a vaccine correctly, there's no need to wear gloves. And so you may have some people that say, I just want to wear gloves. That's okay. But it certainly doesn't alleviate the need for hand hygiene. And what we have to watch is that a lot of times people will not change their gloves between patients, or they'll go and handle the vaccine, then go touch a patient, then go back and handle the vaccine again. So, that's something to think about. So needle depth is another one that is a common misconception associated with administration of vaccines. And again, we know that the efficacy of this is going to be rooted in, can we get the drug into the ideal site within the body, right? So this is just a rule of thumb. Of course, you can sort of make an eyeball judgment when you're in front of a patient. But if I've got somebody who's 300 pounds, that's a male, then having a 1/2-inch needle or a 5/8 inch needle is not going to reach the intramuscular space. And so looking at the size of that arm, we want to have that right needle gauge and right needle length in order to do that. And again, a lot of this information is also contained within the federal kits that are being sent out with the different pieces of equipment, like the needles and syringes as well. One thing I'll mention that's come up quite frequently is that the supplier of those kits, which actually happens to be McKesson Medical Surgical, certainly is sourcing equipment from all around the world trying to keep up with demand. And so it is very, very possible that you will get different supplies every time you get a box. So you may have a different needle and syringe, a different box of gloves, a different box of this that may look slightly different. So as you're especially educating students, make sure they're familiar with the particular needle and syringe, especially that they're using that day. There's been lots and lots of reports related to safety devices where they prematurely activated the safety device and the needle retracted. So just something to think about related to that. And then what about sort of your generalized emergency preparedness? So we want to do things like keep that environment clean. We want to have hand sanitizer available, but we also want to have sort of a dedicated set of individuals that are ready and able to respond to an emergency. So this event that I was referring to that I worked at, we had 2 trucks there. And people may say, well, why did you need 2 trucks there? You didn't really need that. Well, just as what happened when we had to transport somebody out, there was always a unit there. And so if we had somebody that had to go out again and there was no truck, we would have to send another one in. And so really our goal is to plan ahead of time to both recognize very quickly any potential anaphylaxis or somebody vasovagals, for example, which happened a lot. We can be prepared to respond to that. And so you don't want to have people doing multiple roles when they're involved in emergency response. So this is a great opportunity, especially for students, to get familiar with taking vital signs and making sure they get that good patient interaction and contact associated with that. There are multiple different online courses, especially if you're teaching at the EMR level. I just picked one that was, I think it's still free if I'm not mistaken. The Red Cross has sort of talked about this. But when you think about sort of general preparedness, right, we know that anaphylaxis is going to be a low incidence, but certainly it's something that we have to be prepared for. There is a list in the ebook of mandatory versus suggested equipment. For example, mandatory is having a dose of epinephrine available. Optional, for example, is actually having O2 available, which I sort of personally disagree with. Many of you may feel the same way. And then intubation equipment, for example, is optional. Pulse oximeter is optional. So there's certain things that they want you to have readily accessible every single place you do vaccination, and other places you're going to have some of those optional pieces of equipment. And of course, if you have an EMS unit on site, you have a lot of those things. And so everybody that's involved should have a minimum of basic life support training, preferably with some ACLS folks that are dedicated there. And then getting people either involved in drawing up their dose or using one of the auto injectors is another great way to do that. There's some, of course, some of the dosing solutions where you can actually do the pre-dose syringes where the student can draw it up and actually see it right there on the device. And that's really easy to help reduce any potential errors. So the last section I wanted to cover today was really looking at how do we sort of execute all of this? You know, whether you're teaching students to be involved in the process, whether you're involved personally as a faculty member, or you're working in the community as a clinician. So before we do that, Nate, why don't we go ahead and do that next poll question? All right, so have you been personally impacted by COVID-19 with a member of your family becoming infected? So if you had anybody in your family that has actually become infected. So it looks like a nice even split as well. So about 55% of you said yes, and about 45% of you said no. So, you know, it really just, you know, goes back to what's the personal impact. Sometimes I find that, especially EMS providers that have very low resiliency, which many of us are suffering from over the last year, this is a great way to sort of bring it home, right? And this transitions nicely into documentation because we want to ensure that every single thing that we do is well documented, right? Not just from a liability standpoint, but also to ensure that that patient has a good, safe experience, right? Things like our normal demographics, like name and date of birth and gender. What's their contact information? You know, where did we give that vaccine and which arm, for example? This actually became important the other day. We had a patient that got the vaccine in her left arm, claimed she got it in the right arm, and actually was saying that she had nerve damage. And luckily, because there were multiple different levels within our process, they were able to prove that no, the vaccine was not given in that arm, and this was completely unrelated to that. And so there are going to be people that will get confused, or they'll just, you know, erroneously make up information. So that documentation is helpful. That dosing card, so the patient is aware of that, is also valuable for them, serving sort of as that vaccine passport to make sure that they have their record. And then that should be also uploaded into the state documentation system, which almost always you're never going to find EMS particularly involved in that. That's usually going to be public health taking on that particular role. And that's what we really refer to as this concept of an immunization registry. So think about it like if you're going to Walgreens or CVS and you say, print my prescription history or print my vaccination history, same concept here. Most states require us to upload this within 24 hours. And it's a searchable database that if you ever lose your vaccination information or you need to know, and this is particularly helpful for those of us that have children because you can get your vaccine information for your child pretty instantaneously. And it interacts with most of the EHR systems out there, as well as the national pharmacy brands. So if you go get a flu shot, for example, at CVS or Walgreens or Rite Aid or somewhere like that, they're uploading your data into that database so that if you ever lose that information, you can easily go and do that. You can get set up to do this yourself, but again, like I said, it's really not an appropriate use of EMS's time, in my opinion. So I wanted to spend just a few minutes talking about two really, really important topics, which is vaccine hesitancy versus vaccine confidence, right? And so vaccine hesitancy is the concept of that the vaccine will hurt me, right? It's going to cause me harm. Whereas vaccine confidence is, well, how much help is this going to actually provide me? What level of efficacy is it going to do? And we find that the majority of people sort of hover in this vaccine hesitancy bucket. Right? I'm going to feel sick. It's going to give me COVID. I'm not going to be able to work. It doesn't work, that type of thing. And then on the vaccine confidence side, well, do I really need to get this? I'm pretty healthy. I don't need to get this. So there's a lot of this self-rationalization that takes place. And so we know that the most recent data that's aggregated for both Moderna and Pfizer shows that these vaccines remain effective for at least 6 months. We know that particularly the Pfizer vaccine was looked at 95% effective for at least 4 months alone. But again, there'll be more and more data associated with this. But again, the goal was to prevent people from being very sick and out of the hospital and keep them from dying. One other thing I did want to mention that you may or may not have heard about, and this has become particularly important for those individuals that are highly religious, is that there was a sort of misconception that the mRNA vaccines had aborted fetal tissue in them. If you've not heard this, I apologize if this is upsetting, but I wanted to make sure I sort of covered it out of transparency. This is something that CDC's received thousands of questions about. And so there is some sort of truth to some of this in the sense that many vaccines originally used some type of fetal cell line in order to create replication in the actual lab, right? That is not true with these vaccines. And so there's been lots of statements out there about this from the different congregational groups as well. And so I just wanted to make sure to address that because it has come up. I've also had many, many patients ask me about this as well. And it's a very legitimate question. And so we want to make sure that we're well educated on that topic. If you're educating your staff, your students, your faculty, they need to be competent to perform the role that they're being assigned, particularly if they're going to be involved in handling or administering the vaccine. We want to observe, right? There's no better tool than direct observation. Doing things in a skills lab or a sim lab is awesome. It's a great experience, but the real world simulation and sort of understanding what to do if something bad goes wrong. And I'll give you a case in point example. I remember walking through a classroom a few months ago, and there was a really amazing faculty member, and she was talking about giving injections and preparation for her students being involved in a vaccination clinic. And she said something about what happens if the needle, comes off the end of the syringe and sticks in your patient's arm and is left behind. And the students looked horrified. And she walked them through, how to handle it, not to, make your eyes bulge out, all those types of things, to just be very calm and certainly remove the needle. And this happened to a student. And she said, I was so prepared. I was so prepared when it malfunctioned that I was able to handle this very easily, right? And so that sort of direct observation is going to be important. And then looking at ensuring that we have good patient education. You're going to have people that should educate patients at sort of that monitoring period. And then you also should have people that are dedicated to potential emergency response. From an adverse event reporting standpoint, there is a federal law that requires us as healthcare providers to document and report any potential serious adverse reaction. Right now, this does not mean that that adverse reaction is directly related to the vaccine. So for example, let me give you one that has come up frequently, where someone did not draw up properly the amount of dose. So let's say that they're supposed to get 0.5 and they only get 0.2. And it was a dosing error. That is considered a reportable event. If you have somebody where they swell up in their arm, that's a reportable event. if you have a syringe that malfunctions when giving the vaccine and it harms the patient, that's a reportable event. As you can see, not all of those are going to be directly related to the vaccine itself, but that's really up for the FDA and the CDC to sort of weed those pieces out and say, this is not really related, but we're going to go ahead and take a look at it anyways. And then as this is being done, there's essentially three ways we get good data, right? One is from each of us that received the vaccine and our patients, right? Because that's voluntary. We can report that information. As a vaccination provider, which each of us has that capability, we're sort of subjected to mandatory reporting, particularly for things like multi-system inflammatory disease, which we see a lot in kids, any of those other adverse events, and certainly if there's any type of death. And then lastly is the manufacturer of each of these vaccines is required by law to provide monthly safety data reports. And those are looked at in real time. Now, this is what we've always done. Let's now talk about what is being done specifically for this new novel vaccine, and it's called vSafe, right? vSafe is essentially a web-based technology that CDC came up with that allows us to do real-time check-ins to really say, okay, Hudson, you just got the vaccine. Tell me how you're feeling for the next 14 days. Tell me how you're feeling in a few months. Okay, you're getting your second dose. Tell me how you're feeling associated with that. And all of that information is fed into a very rich database at the CDC in Atlanta, and they use that to analyze information. And for example, if they say, well, we've got 44 patients here in this local geography that are experiencing the same exact side effect, or we've got people in all 50 states and it's very sort of isolated, they can then use that from an epidemiology standpoint to really have that conversation and say, is this something that we should be worried about? Is this a safety signal? And they can actually, through the app, directly contact the patients. One thing that I did want to mention to you is that CDC is considered by law a federal public health agency, and they are covered by HIPAA. And so they do have the ability to request medical records and documentation as a federal health agency, and we're required to comply with that, right? They would only do that if there was a need for them to review the patient's overall medical record to determine potential causality. And they do this periodically, and I think it's a pretty great service to say, hey, this is what we suspect, here's what we found, and they'll actually follow up with you as a provider if you report that as well. And so I've included the link there at the bottom. They do additional check-in points at 3, 6, and 12 months, which is great because, again, many of you said, I want to understand sort of those long-term impacts associated with the vaccine. And so this gives us a good idea. And then that's going to generally reset at the second dose. Now, of course, if you get the J&J vaccine, you're not going to have that problem because it's just going to be the one single dose. So if you're wanting to become a provider yourself, you can certainly do that through your state Department of Public Health. There's a whole series of training materials and modules that I'm going to give you links to that talk about everything from your personnel to your process to your product monitoring. And of course, we want to continue to adhere to our general infection control recommendations, regardless of vaccination status. So there is a sort of specific EMS training just in time, if you will, that I've included the link for here. This is a great tool, and there's also some additional ones that I'm about to show you from CDC that I think are even better to get sort of the granularity that's needed. Because as EMS providers, yeah, you give IM injections, absolutely. But vaccination is very, very different than giving an emergency type medication. And so that's really what they're looking for, is more of a broader scale of knowledge related to maintaining the vaccine, understanding how to mix it, for example, keeping it sterile, all those types of things. So these are my three favorite resources, and I've included the links there at the bottom. Again, they will also be included in the ebook, which Nate will send out tomorrow. The first one is the CDC vaccine courses. There is CE available for these, so your state board of EMS may honor these, especially since it's got CDC credits associated with it. There's also the train system, which has, I think, about 10 different courses related to the vaccines as well as COVID. And then lastly is something called the Immunization Action Coalition. I call this the Forum Hub. If you're ever looking for policy, a procedure, a forum, something documentation-wise, and you don't have time to create it yourself, go there. The Immunization Action Coalition has a whole host of resources that are free of charge that you can download, and it will save you hours and hours and hours of your time. Of course, you've got the CDC. Now, I will tell you, and I'm just being very candid, that the CDC website is very overwhelming. One of my very best friends actually this past week took over communications for CDC as a special detail. And I couldn't be more excited because there's been a lot of incongruencies that have come out of CDC, and I think we would all agree to that. And so consistency in messaging and supporting messaging and recommendations by the actual science and sharing that is really critical, especially when dealing with adults, because we want to know the why. What's the rationale behind that particular recommendation? And so you can see the web link that's included here specific for vaccines. One of the best ones is to click on that button over there that says answering patients' questions. This contains your sort of top 50 questions that will come up from your patients. And this is a great student research opportunity to give them sort of a research paper or some type of project related to researching that information. I mentioned earlier, I wanted to give you the new video. This is the CDC patient education video. I've included the YouTube link there for you. This is something that if you have a TV monitor in your monitoring area, right, put this up. Have this play. If you've got somebody that's going to be waiting to get their vaccine, play it in there as well. The more they see this, the better. But it walks them through what to expect and sort of the general premises of the COVID-19 vaccines. There's also a social media toolkit. So if you're involved in social media, whether individually and professionally, or as an agency or an institution, this has got all of the tools and resources you could possibly want. It's got, JPEG images, press release statements, whatever you may be involved with, chances are some of the resources will be available for you there. The same thing is available through the FDA. This is particular for the licensed vaccines that you have access to. And then lastly, I've given you a couple tools. Some of the CDC resources, you'll have your ebook. All of those can help us become essentially a vaccine ambassador, right? And remember that vaccination is still an individual and very personal choice. And so I'm very cautious, even as an infectious disease person, to not sort of shove it down someone's throat, but rather listen attentively, listen with empathy, and try to understand where that person is coming from, to answer their questions, to make sure that if they do decide to move forward, that I make it easy, right? And so as you're educating your students, help them be vaccine ready. Make sure that they understand the concepts and the safety information and how to respond to an emergency. And then sign up for the FDA and the CDC RSS feeds, which are available on their website. You can get a weekly digest, which is probably what I'd recommend. And that will give you a nice sort of real-time view of everything that's taking place, especially if you go to the CDC's website and take a look at what's new. That's really your best source for information. So I put up my contact information in case you have additional questions after our time together. But at this point, Nate, I'm going to turn it over to you to open it up for Q&A.
Thank you, sir. I really appreciate this. It's very informative, and we've touched on some really important things. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to send those in. I want to start off with kind of the most recent and pressing things. Can you give us just a quick rundown of some of the things that you've been seeing and maybe some of your thoughts on what's been happening with this pause with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine?
Absolutely. So I knew that was going to be a question that was going to come up. So the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is, first of all, not an mRNA vaccine. It's a viral vector vaccine. And so I think that's first and foremost. Number two is that we've only seen a very small number of cases in general. And so the total number, I believe, is about 6.8 million doses that have been administered here in the United States so far, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And out of those, we've only seen 6 cases of this very, very rare blood clotting issue, right? And so what we're particularly concerned with is that the type of blood clot, right, which is really a cerebral venous sinus thrombosis, is not one we can treat with our traditional clot busting medications like heparin, because we're also seeing this associated with thrombocytopenia. And all of the data has pointed to people, and it's all women so far, that have been between the 18 and 48 years of age, and it's all been between 6 and 13 days after vaccination. So that, if you think about that in sort of overall numbers, that is not a lot of people from an incidence or epidemiology standpoint. 6.8 total doses, only 6 people, that's very, very, very low. So that alone is not a significant safety signal. However, the reason that they've paused is because this particular type of clot is not one that we can readily treat. And so they're really concerned about that. We've seen very similar things related to the AstraZeneca vaccine in Europe, and there has been preliminary data that showed causality associated with that. Now, keep in mind, though, that these vaccines, again, are tricking your body into thinking you have COVID. And so as part of that natural antibody response, you're going to see an inflammatory response, which causes the fever and some of the other things. So there may be some additional recommendations related to screening of certain individuals that we have to look at, but that's not something we're going to know instantaneously. So of course, this pause took place this morning, on Tuesday, April 13th. By tomorrow, there will be a meeting of specifically the ACEP committee, which is that independent advisory board through CDC, and FDA has already had a meeting today, and they're having another meeting tomorrow. So it is very, very likely within the next 5 days that we will have more information about potential causality. Normally, when these things happen, it's not causal, or they can't prove it. But there's always that possibility that it is. And I think some of the European data is going to be pulled into this conversation as well. Even though it's not for the same vaccine, there's still the same type of modality and mechanism of action. So there's no change at all to the Pfizer or the Mrna vaccine, completely different mode of action, mRNA vaccines, no changes to recommendations there as well. So hopefully that answers that question.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir. And we have another one that's very specific about having experiencing young females hesitant at receiving the COVID-19 vaccine. So do you have any suggestions, maybe something that you might tell them that might be able to ease that hesitancy?
Yeah, I think Robert's question is really important. So, the first sort of concern was that these people are going to be infertile. That was one of the big concerns, and that's been disproven. The second concern was that it was going to actually cause a spontaneous abortion. That's also been disproven. What we absolutely know is that if a pregnant mother gets COVID, that the rate of complications for both her as well as the fetus is extremely high. And so that's been proven in multiple different studies in multiple parts of the world. So again, going back to that risk benefit equation, does it make more sense for me to risk getting COVID? Now, certainly if this is a healthcare worker that, again, could not be exposed clinically, they could work a desk job where they're by themselves or work from home or something like that, different story. But most of us don't have that luxury. It's not like an EMS, you can respond to calls from your house. So it's a little bit different, but if you can also look and refer them to the OBGYN association groups, all 3 societies that I've seen have put out joint position statements that said that, this is perfectly acceptable, have a consultation with your OB if you wish, but they all recommend it. So, that's something to think about as well.
Wonderful. And we have another comment that came in about worrying, being fearful of what would happen if they had received cosmetic Botox as well. So
yeah, this is another, potential contraindication or complication associated with this. The way that, and there's probably about 15 of these that I could call out pretty readily. Here's sort of how I address it, just to sort of give some perspective. If you have patients that are asking specific questions, or colleagues or whoever it is, you can go to the CDC's database. And I'll share that link with Nate so he can pass it out to you. And you can actually look in real time all the way up through the day before and look at every single vaccine associated event. And you can separate and slice that data however you want. So for example, if you want to look at only women under 60, or if you only want to look at Moderna or Pfizer, or you only want to look at dose number 2, that's one of the ways I was able to determine how many people would have a reaction with the mRNA dose number 2 versus dose number 1. And it's pretty substantially different. And so the Botox and some of the cosmetic fillers and things like that, that data is actually in there. And it's a great way to sort of overcome those fears with real-time data that's being inputted based on our colleagues and peers out there, right? People that have received the vaccine that have provided that. And that data is all blinded. So it's not like somebody can go in there and manipulate it. And again, it's a self-reported thing from the patients as well as the healthcare providers as well. But there's absolutely, I think Connie's right. There's concern about that. There's concern about pregnancy. I've had a lot of questions about breastfeeding, for example, as well. So, this is something to really think about. Nathan, I see your comment in there about, I wish CDC would push those numbers more. Specifically the number of adverse reactions versus the total number of doses given. I couldn't agree with you more. One of the absolute best things to do is to go to the CDC data tracker page. And on there, you can actually break down the total number of vaccine doses that have been delivered versus administered. Then you can look at it all the way down to the state level. But what I like to look at is the total number of people that have been vaccinated. right? And sort of how many people are in that limbo between dose 1 and 2, if it's the 2-dose series. And you can get a lot of information out of that. So I agree with you. If you say, hey, let's just hypothetically say we've given 150 million doses and we've only had 2,500 adverse events. Well, that tells you instantaneously that there is no safety signal, right? That is just not even a blip on the radar compared to any other clinical trial. Unfortunately, we've got a lot of sensitivity around this, and certainly the news media does not help us. But we know that this is really one of our best opportunities to prevent continued community transmission, get to that point of herd immunity, and hopefully get rid of these dang masks, because I don't know about you, but I'm sick and tired of wearing them everywhere I go. So hopefully that answers that question as well.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. And we have officially crossed over the hour, so I really appreciate you being here for this presentation. And we've answered pretty much every question that I've seen come in. But if anyone has any other questions that you're holding back right now, please feel free to reach out. And I will be including all this contact information and all of the resources in the ebook that we've mentioned throughout today's presentation. I will send that out in the follow-up email that you will receive after today's presentation. So if you are looking for any of those resources, they will be sent right to you. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me or Dr. Garrett. Do you have any closing words that you want to say before you get out of here? Sorry, but I do want to say I just sent the link for CEUs also in the chat. So if any of you guys are interested in getting the certificate, please follow that link.
No, other than just thank you for the continued work that each of you do. I know this past year has been god awful. And we're just so excited to see you take an opportunity to join it. Nate, thanks for your leadership on getting these webinars continuing to go each and every week for the membership.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So thank you all very much. I really appreciate you all being here. And thank you again, Dr. Garrett, for sharing with us. It's been really great. Please stay safe out there, everyone.